Our next talk is Byron Hyde on philosophy is better when it's diverse. Please.
Yes, excellent. Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much for having me online, particularly at such last-minute notice. I unfortunately wasn't able to get some funding that I was anticipating, and so wasn't able to make the international trip. But nevertheless, I'm very happy to be presenting online, even though I can't see you all in person. So today, I should probably preface this by saying that I am, by trade, a philosopher of science. This is a talk that's aiming to contribute to some extent to meta-philosophy, but I wouldn't self-identify as a meta-philosopher. What I'm largely going to be doing in this talk is taking some relatively uncontroversial literature from philosophy of science and applying it to the context of meta-philosophy to see if we can learn something about philosophic method from the scientific method that philosophers of science are talking about. So, obviously, as per the title here, I'm arguing that philosophy is better when it's diverse, and so one of the first things that obviously we should discuss is what kind of property diversity is, because I am making a key assumption here, which is probably fairer to make in the context of science than it is in philosophy, and that's that research occurs within a community. Now, obviously, in philosophy, we don't often like to write papers together. We don't often like to do community research, although obviously that trend is changing a little bit these days. And so I better explain a little bit why I've made this assumption that research should be communal in the first place, and why the future of research ought to be communal, and why the sciences tend to think that as well. So just a second quick prefatory note here. I like to refer to scientific objectivity occasionally. For people not particularly familiar with the literature on scientific objectivity or objectivity more generally, it's a real nightmare term. It means a whole lot of things to different people. I want to be clear, when I use the term objectivity, I'm not referring to moral objectivism. I'm not referring to kind of value freedom or impartiality or anything like that. I'm referring to it in the way that philosophers of science now mostly refer to it, which is the virtue of kind of getting it right, converging on truth, avoiding epistemic threats. Really, it's just an epistemic virtue, really, of doing research that's not horrendously epistemically threatened. So the theory here is that individuals are very biased. This is pretty well established within the psychological literature. We have a huge number of biases that affect us consciously and subconsciously, but mainly the subconscious ones being the problematic ones. And often we're not capable, as much as we do our de-biasing training or things like that, we're not particularly capable of dealing with those ourselves. Ultimately, the theory goes, we are fundamentally biased, and not a whole lot we can do about that. Well, one of the things we can do about that is bring some of our friends along, because I might be biased the way that my friend's not, my friend might be biased the way that I'm not, and so we can kind of self-check one another, and I can analyze his or her work, and she can analyze my work, and so together we're slightly less biased. I don't say unbiased because, of course, I'm sure there's groupthink, and there are all sorts of biases that affect groups, but together we can be slightly less biased than we are as individuals. And so communities can embody properties possessed by one of its members, because they can have a slight reduction in bias, whereas I might have bias X, the community, because I have my colleague within this community who is capable of removing bias X. It means that within the community we can achieve some element of objectivity in the sense of getting it right, that perhaps we can't as individuals. So objectivity is a community virtue, not an individual virtue. I'm trying to give a very, very quick overview of the literature and philosophy of science on this point. This is really the guts of the talk, but important to mention at the beginning. This is why philosophers of science are largely arguing these days that objectivity is a community virtue, not an individual virtue. It's because of this the individual nature of bias and the idea that it's probably uneliminable on an individual basis. And so what I'm going to argue throughout the rest of this talk with you here at the very bottom there is that the right property that we want the community to have, and so I'm talking about community virtue here, diversity, of course, as an individual, it's very difficult for me to be a diverse individual and have a variety of properties within me as one individual person. I'm talking about a community here and the kind of features that we want of a collective of researchers, or in this case, a collective of philosophers. And so, as Kitcher says, science is well ordered when it embodies all human points of view. This is the perspective that I'm essentially going to be defending here for the case of philosophy. But as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm going to begin with the science. So why is it that philosophers of science and theorists say that diverse science is better? Why does diversity improve scientific research? Well, there are two reasons. It improves our evidence, and it improves our use of evidence. And so the first here is how it improves our evidence. Here I'm drawing from standpoint theory. Anybody at all familiar with philosophy of science or teaches an introductory course on epistemology will of course be very familiar with this by now, very prominent within the 80s and 90s in particular. The long and short of it is essentially that every individual has their own standpoint. Everybody comes to their research with their own positionality, their own life experiences, their own values. And that corresponds to the evidence that not only they have themselves in terms of their own individual life experiences, if you're doing, for example, ethnographic research, but it also corresponds to the evidence that you can actually access as an individual. So here is not just their experiential evidence, but the evidence that they can actually see. For example, one of the ways that this happens is in the determination of what actually counts as evidence. So I've got two examples here. A conservative might dismiss liberal evidence, or quantitative researchers might dismiss qualitative evidence. This is very common. If you look at systematic reviews, for example, it's very common that they will take randomized control trials and nice tough stuff like this and say that's great evidence, but then they'd have something like personal experience or autoethnography or studies like this, and they would be much more inclined to dismiss that and say, well, that's not really evidence of anything, it doesn't really prove anything. And so this is the way in which the concept of evidence is value-laden, or the determination of it is value-laden. And so that very much depends on a group of individuals. Again, you can imagine in terms of, let's say, systematic reviews, if you were to have some qualitative researchers with some of those quantitative researchers, if they were to try to make that kind of value judgment and say, oh, well, we're going to exclude those ethnographic studies from our systematic review because that's not real evidence, you can imagine the qualitative researchers speaking up at that point and saying, well, no, that's not a fair judgment to make. We see that as evidence. And so this is the kind of thing where you can see that this kind of diversity in this sense is increasing the actual evidence base that the scientists have. So science achieves strong objectivity when it contains these kind of diverse standpoints. That is, it's more capable of avoiding epistemic threats when it's diverse. In this case, the epistemic threats are myopia and asymmetry of scientific challenge. Myopia being, as in your perhaps, but incapable of seeing the wood for the trees. Conservative, but that potentially dismissing level evidence happens very often in. Can't think of an example of myopia. Actually, I'm rushing to my example of asymmetry of scientific challenge, which happens very often in climate change skeptics and very often in creation science. Asymmetry of scientific challenge is essentially where you erect tailor-made criteria and you're much, much tougher on your enemies than you are on yourself. And so you can imagine creationists, when they get some mean-driven bit of evidence that perhaps the flood happened 4,000 years ago, that they're very, very quick to demonstrate that this is proof of the flood. But when you have 10,000 studies demonstrating the opposite, they're ultra critical of these kinds of things. And so again, this is a way in which individual values can contribute to the evidence that we actually accept within our research. The second way is in terms of the use of evidence. Intellectual opponents are much more likely to be critical of one another, and so again, you can kind of see this feeding in from my creationist example just now. If you have evolutionary biologists and creationists on the same research team, as you can imagine, they're probably going to be vehemently critical of one another. This is not just in terms of their theories, but also their use of methods, the interpretations that they're making, prevents all of these kind of things like asymmetry and scientific challenge. And so this kind of criticality is widely recognized as an epistemic virtue. In the context of science, we refer to this phrase here from Robert Merton, sociologist of scientific knowledge, very famous one from the early 20th century, called organized skepticism, which is essentially just criticality, but as a community virtue rather than just as an individual virtue. And so, as I say, criticism of theories, methods, inferences, it encourages the robustness of all of these things that we're engaging with as part of our research. The yes man makes a bad peer reviewer. This is something that people are generally, I think that this, even outside of a scientific context to a philosophic context, should be something that is not too objectionable idea. This is not massively groundbreaking stuff that I'm presenting here. I think that a lot of this is quite intuitive. There are some examples of the reasons why specific fields have been picked on for having too many yes men in their peer review. The Sokol affair in 1996 is one example. The Grievance Studies affair more recently, which picked on a couple of fields for having inadequate peer review because there were too many reviewers who very much shared the theoretical standpoint that articles were arguing for, or arguing from, and therefore, we're not necessarily as critical of them as perhaps they ought to be as reviewers. So this is, I haven't included the citations in here. If you're interested in citations, they're all in the abstract itself. But again, scholars have criticized women's studies for associating with the women's movement because they claim that it lost its significant intellectual autonomy and that criticality was replaced by ideological rigidity and a push to conformity. So again, you're seeing the problem here with a lack of diversity when you have too many people who share the same opinion, who have the same kind of standpoint that are coming into their research, and we lose the objectivity, that freedom from epistemic threats that we have when we have a much more critical, much more oppositional group of thinkers in place. And so diversity prevents this kind of dogmatism from setting in. You're constantly on edge when you're surrounded by intellectual enemies. You're constantly on edge. You have to make sure that your method section is really robust. You have to make sure that your inference is genuinely supported by the evidence. You can't jump to rash conclusions because you know that the peer reviewer who wants to prove you wrong is going to pick up on that, or your colleague, as it may be, depending on the exact way that we achieve this diversity. So that's a quick overview of some of the theory, some of the philosophy of science on why diversity improves scientific reasoning. Let's now have a look at some of the empirical evidence. The European Commission and National Institutes of Health obviously like empirical evidence. Philosophers of science struggle to have much policy impact because the policymakers don't tend to be very interested in the theoretical things that we have to say. And so, unsurprisingly, there has to be some kind of evidence, and there is, to get scientific institutions to buy into these things that the philosophers are saying. As the European Commission says, and the National Institute of Health, well, both of them use this term, they believe that diversity will produce an innovation dividend and that it will pave the way to new discoveries. So they really see the future of science as being diverse. It is a core virtue of science, and in fact, the National Science Foundation, in their review of funding applications, and well, I don't know if they now do post January 2025, but they certainly did have within their criteria for analysis, they had what do they call it? A wider impacts criteria, and that was the phrase, wider impacts, which required things like diversity and things like that, because they really believe that this is absolutely a core scientific objective. So, what's some of the empirical evidence that they do so? So here are our three main studies that I picked up on. I will rush through them very, very quickly for the sake of time. Study number one, a load of participants were assigned to teams and asked to solve a set of tasks. What they found is that it didn't really matter how intelligent the individual team members were. The teams themselves, when they were structured correctly, were displayed a much higher collective intelligence than any individual possibly could, any individual member of the team. What accounted for that greater collective intelligence than individual intelligence? Well, they identified that it was as a result of conversational turn-taking. They found that, in short, the groups were much more capable of reasoning together and basically following these kind of processes that I've just outlined in theory. They were checking one another and analysing each other's biases and coming to a much stronger, much more robust conclusion. What was absolutely key in that was the fact that they were actually conversing. They were not speaking over one another. They had an actual conversation. And what they observed was that they attributed this to the presence of a higher number of women on the best performing teams. They believed that the women exhibited high levels of social receptiveness and that it was them who was responsible for the increase in equality in participation. So study number 2, so obviously that supports the view that diversity therefore improves the collective problem solving in these sorts of contexts. Well, proves I don't want to jump to conclusion. Suggests that the theory is probably correct. Study number 2, again, a very similar study, this time observational rather than a slightly more randomized control trial, observed a load of interdisciplinary teams of scientists and engineers. They found that women were much more capable than men of recognizing the expertise of fellow team members. This person who ran the study, Joshi, believes that men on teams often attributed expertise to non-expertise related factors. So rather than, as the women were emphasizing things like educational qualifications, men would emphasize things like age or other characteristics that Joshi believed were not relevant to one's expertise. And Joshi found that gender diversity was also a more effective use of expertise of individual team members. So again, that the use of evidence there has been better as a result of greater diversity within the team. What's really important here is, of course, both of these studies are talking about an increase in the number of women that we have in our research, and so you could just as well conclude from this that, okay, well, excellent, it's not diversity that improves science, it's women. Let's have lots of women. If men are talking over one another, if men are not recognizing other people's expertise, let's have teams full of women. They're going to listen to one another, they're going to recognize one another's expertise. Well, Woolley et al., who conducted the first study, 5 years later, they conducted another. And what they found that actually, if you do really just do that and you increase the number of women, actually the benefit massively flattens out and then eventually begins to reverse towards the end. And so it really is diversity that, or at least what they concluded from this one study, is it really is diversity that makes science better. It's not just the inclusion of women, it's the combination of these characteristics that the woman brought to these teams in combination with the characteristics that the men already had within these teams. And so it really is the diversity that strengthens the objectivity of scientific research. Now, you'll notice that I've been speaking about diversity here. Diversity what exactly? I have split from the first part of my talk, where I was talking about the theory, and I was talking about intellectual diversity. I was talking about intellectual opponents. I was talking about creationists and evolutionary biologists and climate skeptics and climate scientists. And so this is intellectual diversity I'm talking about. Whereas when I have a look at the empirical evidence just now, we're looking at demographic diversity, we're looking at gender diversity, we're talking about men and women. These are obviously not the same thing. One of my criticisms of standpoint theory is it strikes me as too linked to demographic characteristics. I think a lot of academics have the liberal tendency to think that it doesn't seem fair to say that you must think a certain way because you look a certain way. It seems very old-fashioned. It seems very essentialist to say that, oh, you're a woman, so you must think like that. You're a man, so you must think this way. You're black, so you must think like that. You're white, so you must think like that. It feels very, very old-fashioned to put people into these kind of boxes, but nevertheless, it would appear that that's what the empirical evidence demonstrates. The empirical evidence is not testing for intellectual diversity, it is combining the demographic diversity, and it's finding from the demographic diversity that there is an increase in collective problem solving, an improvement, in collective problem solving. The way that I theorize this is that insofar as my theory suggests, well, not my theory, the theory of standpoint epistemologists, is that insofar as intellectual diversity is what is important for science, that's what provides us with this kind of collective skepticism, is what provides us with all of these diversity dividends, innovation dividends. The only theory that we can really come up with is that perhaps this demographic diversity produces this intellectual diversity. And so in other words, men and women really don't think alike. And so it would appear that that's the explanation for why it is the case that a diverse group of individuals in terms of demographic diversity results in these intellectual characteristics like parity in term taking and things like that. So to conclude now, what about philosophy? So the same two reasons why science is improved by diversity, I believe that philosophy is also improved by diversity. So firstly, applied and experimental philosophers often use empirical evidence. And so the exact reason that we had in the case of the scientists, in terms of the empirical evidence that we have access to, a greater set of empirical evidence as a result of a diversity of individual standpoints, applies directly to philosophy in the case of applied and experimental philosophers. This very talk, I've just spoken about a load of empirical evidence in order to make a philosophical point. And so I think this applies very much to philosophy. But I also think that potentially a much stronger way, it applies to theoretical philosophy, well, really theoretical philosophy that genuinely strays away entirely from empirical evidence. Because this phrase that I use, theoretical evidence, in philosophy, it's important, at least these days, to cite other people, to use other literature. It would be bizarre if you were to go and try to solve metaphysics all by yourself without ever having a look at what other people are saying. And so the ability to see other bodies of literature, the ability to collate that together, the more literature we have, the more evidence we have, the better our philosophy is going to be. More evidence makes a better philosophy, just as it makes science better. For example, dialectic, not to suggest that this is the only philosophic method that benefits from having more evidence, but this is one obvious one, really can only function within a community, and it probably can only function within a diverse community as well. If I come up with a thesis, it's very unlikely that I'm going to be able to have a really, really piercing objection to my own thesis. It's much more likely that somebody else is living along who vehemently disagrees with me, and they're going to come up with a genius idea and say, no, you're terribly, terribly wrong. Here's my monograph that completely refutes everything that you say. So a diverse community is much more critical and contains more opinions on the topic. That's the way that we define an intellectually diverse community. We need more standpoints on philosophic research, and so that suggests that diversity improves philosophic research in the same way that it improves scientific research, whether that's through the use of theoretical evidence or empirical evidence. The second way is that diversity improves our problem solving, improves the way that we use evidence as well. Now, even if you disagree about philosophy and its having evidence and searching for empirical evidence and things like that, even if you think that I really can get away with just imagining up my own evidence and my own examples and counterexamples, and I can kind of carry out this synthesis all by myself and really conduct good philosophy, without the views of other people. Philosophy is all about using evidence. It's all about method, and philosophy is all about argument. And so, for example, a well-established method of good argument dialectus is what I've just been alluding to. I come up with an idea, of course I preempt some objections. The classic philosophic method that we all use in papers, it's a lot easier to preempt those when we have a diverse community, when we have people, whether you go to conferences like this, or whether you go to work in progress paper seminars, or whether you speak to colleagues, when people who disagree with you are able to come up with those and say, well, have you thought about this? It's much, much easier when you have that diversity of opinions. Whether I can have that diversity of opinions within myself is unlikely, but when you have that within a community, it's much, much easier to conduct good philosophic work and think about those objections in advance when you have those objections coming from within a diverse community. An intellectually diverse community has more opinions, and so naturally it has more objections. Equality and participation and use of expertise are also improved by a diverse community, and so again, it makes it a lot easier to address those objections.
Sorry, you should wrap up if you want any questions. You have 2 minutes for the Q&A.
Last 30 seconds, the last point I'm making just here makes it a lot easier to address objections. This conclusion here just summarizes the point I've made. Again, it's simply 2 reasons really. Diversity improves participation, it improves the evidence that we have and improves our use of evidence. These are the two main points I'm using. In the same way that it improves it for science, it improves it for philosophy as well. Our evidence looks a little bit different, but we use it in the same kind of ways. And so just to end here with a couple of, not suggesting these are robust policies at all to be made, but some potential policy implications. Being aware of homogeneous fields, study fields in which there's too much agreement. Of course, we have to encourage the critical perspective, the whole nature of the mechanism that I've just been describing here. In terms of diversity, of course, diversity can only operate if we actually allow the criticality, if we actually allow the diversity of opinions. Positionality statements, which are essentially where people are declaring what their either opinions or their individual demographic characteristics are within a paper, are potentially methodologically justified. The same is true of affirmative action policies, insofar as diversity improves our philosophy. It methodologically makes sense that we ought to have a more diverse academy. Of course, know that there are still ethical questions about these two things. Editors should look for intellectually and or demographically diverse peer reviewers. There should be more collaboration in philosophy. At the point I made at the beginning, it's community diversity is a community virtue, not an individual virtue. It follows that we ought to be doing slightly more collaborative work, and of course, the type of collaborative work we should be doing, the final point there, is with more diverse colleagues. That could be potentially internationalization. I've not had enough time to talk about different ways of achieving that. Of course, I mentioned gender. We have the evidence there in terms of the link between gender diversity and intellectual diversity. But of course, we can imagine how those same kind of standpoints and different characteristics could be achieved through racial diversity, age diversity, nationality, diversity, nationality, ethnicity, or all of these kind of things that could potentially result in people having vastly different life experiences and ways of doing things, which account for this great criticality and which improve the philosophical research we're doing. So that is everything. I will leave you there on that slide for a reminder of my argument. And that's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.